Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Well, thanks for coming. I wasn't sure how many people would come to this. So, I mean, I had a birthday last week, so I too have been contemplating aging. I'm going to just tell you one quick thing about Edmund, because I interviewed him for our TV station. He's had a long, distinguished career in academia, the School of Social Welfare and Gerontology, and he's published all kinds of books and articles and all this. But it all started by reading Erskine Caldwell. Maybe he'll tell you that story, I don't know. So anyway, so here's Edmund to tell us about his book, Contemplative Aging, A Way of Being in Later Life.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. It's good to be here, and it's especially good to see some familiar faces and some older faces. Microphone? Yeah.
Make sure
I say it's good to see familiar faces and older faces, because that means this is the right audience for this particular talk.
Can you hear?
I'm talking, of course, about contemplative aging. And if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is present some historical and research background from gerontology to have a foundation, really, for talking about the book. And also, if you don't mind, I'm going to do some reading here because I have a number of quotes, and at age 84, my memory retrieval isn't what it used to be, and I think many of you can probably resonate to that. Yes. Oh, quick. Gerontology is
I don't have any left.
a fairly new discipline, really. I think it formally probably around 1945. The Gerontological Society of America was established, and it's an interdisciplinary field. It has a range of disciplines from academia, psychology, all the way up to economics, and also human service professionals, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, nurses, all members of the Society on Aging. Now, that's different from geriatrics, and I think it's an important distinction, because geriatrics is a medical field. It has to do with the problems and illnesses of old age, so it's very age-specific. Gerontology, on the other hand, covers the whole spectrum of aging from birth to death. So somebody like an Erik Erikson, who had such profound insights into old age and the issues of old age, who was a child psychologist and a child analyst, nevertheless could write very, very well and meaningfully about old age. I'm sure you're probably aware from the popular press and literature that there's a tremendous emphasis on the importance of staying active and engaged, physically, socially, every which way, to continue as much as you can, as humanly possible, just keep going. It's a kind of almost like a middle age ethos that tells us to keep it going the way it was. Now that's keeping active socially and physically, of course, is very important, and it's not to be overlooked. It goes without saying, this should be maintained. But the overemphasis on this tends to bypass the important, what can I say, matters of mind and spirit that should become part of old age, to deal with the inevitable losses, social and physical, that are going to occur. So that's a bit of a problem. Some of you probably have read some books and literature on this whole thing, but I'd like to quote from a distinguished orthopedic surgeon. There's an article in a local newspaper And the title of it is Baby Boomers Fueling the Rise in Joint Surgeries. We're becoming a nation of bum knees, worn out hips, and sore shoulders. Baby boomer bones and joints are taking a pounding, spawning a boom in operations to fix them. Knee replacement surgeries have doubled over the last decade and more than tripled in the 45 to 64-year-old age group. New research shows that hips are trending that way too. Boomeritis, or fix-me-itis, as this doctor puts it, is a mindset that says, fix me at any cost, turn back the clock. And he ends up by saying that the boomers are the first generation trying to stay alive in droves on an aging frame. Now, there's strong research evidence that goes way back into the 1960s. Bernice Newgarden at the University of Chicago did very extensive studies with her team of psychologists in terms of what kinds of personality changes occur in later life. At this point, the study was 65 and beyond. And what they found was evidence to the effect that the older persons, and I usually refer to them as elders, rather than trying to actively control or alter their environments and their circumstances, tend to adapt more psychologically and physically, even philosophically, if you will, to their declining strengths and circumstances. Now, this is a kind of natural psychological development. It's a kind of turn inward that matches the physical decrements and social decrements that occur inevitably in old age. Now, rather than attempt to forcefully change these circumstances, what they will do is turn to a more reflective, contemplative kind of approach to things. It's what I would call the contemplative type of aging. So there's more of an emphasis on being than on doing, okay? In a sense, you can say that you can't separate the two. They're semantically, they're very much related. But the idea, for example, if you're going to meditate, let's say, which is very central to contemplation, you're doing something after all. If you're sitting in meditation, you're doing something. So you can't really separate them that way. But there's the issue of a balance and that shifting in those later years. I'd like to quote from an 81-year-old woman who was part of a research study, and these are her words. I always had to be accomplishing something. I'm talking about every minute of every day, sun up to sundown. That's how I was brought up. There were no idle hands in our house. Raising my family, a day was wasted unless I sewed a dress, put up a week's worth of soup, and darned a dozen socks. Then I did this all over again, helping my daughter raise her family. Now I'm an old lady and my hands are knotted up with arthritis. There's hardly anything I can work on anymore. I used to wander around the house muttering, useless hands, useless life. I certainly couldn't sit on a couch and say it was a good day. So lately I've decided to stop fighting it. I've been letting my mind roam while my hands rest. You know what I'm thinking now? There's not a thing wrong with sitting still. You just have to relax into it. So that's a kind of natural evolution of the contemplative approach. Now, one really kind of remarkable instance of turning in toward a more being orientation was the exemplary man of action, George Washington, who on his retirement from the command of the victorious Continental Army wrote the following to the Marquis de Lafayette. I am not only retired from all public employments, but I am retiring within myself, and shall be able to view the solitary walk and tread the paths of private life with heartfelt satisfaction. Envious of none, I am determined to be pleased with all. And this, my dear friend, being the order of my march, I will move gently down the stream of life until I sleep with my fathers. George Washington, after a successful war. Now, the contemplative approach doesn't mean being inactive. It simply means being active and doing in a more selective and wiser way with one's body. And there are compensations for this. As one elder put it, I'm slowing down but waking up. I'm producing less but learning more. I'm doing less but I'm experiencing more. Now, in the field of gerontology, there were two competing theories or orientations that began very early on in the field. The first one came from sociologists for the most part, and it was called Disengagement Theory. And the way this worked was the belief was there was a mutual, now it might be implicit, not necessarily public or anything, but an implicit kind of agreement that older people would step aside, would retire, would move out of the workforce and so on, voluntarily allowing younger people to come into the workforce and take on the responsibilities of adulthood and so on, and that this would be a good sociological replacement mechanism. Well, it didn't take very long for all kinds of opposition to arise within the field of gerontology. And the alternate theory, as you might imagine, was called activity theory. So we get back to this thing. What they were saying is, no, older people do not voluntarily remove themselves from society. They don't voluntarily retire. They want to stay active, but society has it set up in such a way that they have to. They're being pushed out. This may be an extreme example, but I'm trying to make the point that there were these two opposing views. And essentially they're saying that, no, given proper circumstances, older people want to remain very active in society and in our economy. So here we've had this battle going on, and I would have to say that disengagement theory pretty much lost out. Activity theory, both in the professions and as in popular press, won the day. However, some things happened. They did some very extensive studies in Scandinavia of older people, in Sweden and Denmark in particular. And it was a team of sociologists there who literally studied thousands of people using questionnaires and structured interviews with older people. And they came up with a theory, which is part of your handout there, called gerotranscendence. A man by Lars Tornström was the leading researcher of that particular group. And they had some, what they felt were key findings that sort of got beyond this debate about disengagement versus activity theory. And if I'll go over these quickly, you've got them on your handout, but they, first of all, a redefinition of the perception of life and death with a decrease in the fear of death. By the way, death anxiety scales and so on, older people are the least frightened or anxious about dying. Might be concerned about how they die, but the fear of dying itself, no. Interestingly enough, the middle-aged people tend to be much more along that line. There's an increased affinity, for the inner life. That goes back to the findings that Bernice Newgarden had in Chicago, that there's this kind of interiority that develops. Then there's a redefinition of perception of time, space, and objects. There's a decrease in superfluous social interaction. There's a decreased interest in material things, particularly accumulation of material goods. There's an increasing feeling of connection to the universe, that is, with nature, with the seasons, and so on. There's an increased feeling of affinity with past and future generations. All of you can sort of check with yourselves to see whether, in fact, this is something that you're finding. And more time spent in meditation. Now, meditation is in quotes here. It can mean a range of things, and that 81-year-old woman with the arthritic hands would qualify as meditating when she totally relaxes and takes it easy. Now, there were some criticisms of the theory of gerotranscendence by American gerontologists, and they said, look, there may be a bias. I mean, if those of you who are familiar with the movies of Ingmar Bergman and so on say, you know, these Scandinavians, they have a kind of deep philosophical view of things. Now, are Americans like that? So they actually replicated the studies that Tornstrom did in Scandinavia. And they used the same questionnaires, they used the same interview schedules, and they actually added some elements using focus groups of older people talking to one another about their experiences. And what they came up with was there's no question that there was a greater satisfaction with their interior life, again, that interiority thing. Secondly, there was a feeling of greater connection with nature and the universe, which is also part of the gerontology, and very definitely having less fear of death. So it pretty much corroborated most of what you're seeing there on that handout. Now, as the whole business of being and doing, and that balance, of course, is crucial to this whole thing. I was particularly impressed reading a book by Erich Fromm, and many of you are familiar, of course, with his writing, Escape from Freedom and the Sane Society. Clinical psychologist, psychoanalyst, but of course very attuned to social issues. And he was working on a book called The Art of Being in his 70s. And unfortunately, he died in the process, and the book was published posthumously. But in it, he said that essential to the art of being is mindfulness and meditation. Meditation was central as far as he was concerned. And the type of meditation that he was proposing is a pretty good fit for old age in many respects. It's called mindfulness meditation, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that term because there are now organizations and so on providing mindfulness kinds of practice and variations. At any rate, unlike something like transcendental meditation where you have a mantra, here you pay attention to your breath. You simply follow the breath, and the breath makes sense because of its centrality to life and existence. After all, if you stop breathing, you die. So that makes a lot of sense. It's the bridge that connects life to consciousness, and it unites mind and body. So that makes a good deal of sense. As a matter of fact, of course, some of you know this, that the word for breath and spirit is identical in various languages. In Latin, it's spiritus, and as I understand it, in Hebrew, as well as in some other languages, and in Greek, the words are identical. At any rate, the thing about it is that it's not just sitting meditation that works this way. It's actually very basic kinds of things, elemental things of life. Walking, eating, thinking, hearing, seeing. All these things are done with mindfulness, slowly and with attention. Even chores that we ordinarily want to get rid of and do away with quickly, washing dishes, peeling potatoes, whatever. It has to be, it gets done carefully and mindfully, in which it's made almost like a rite, almost like a religious rite, and it gives a certain sense of sanctity to everyday life. Now, it's not only used for this kind of serenity or peace of mind, but it's also, for some of you to be aware of this, it's used for pain and dealing with pain and illness. I don't know if any of you have read the writings of John Kabat-Zinn, but he's at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, and he heads up the stress reduction clinic, which deals with not only stress, but pain, particularly chronic pain, which is so important to in old age. And he has a book called Full Catastrophe Living, which gives a great deal of detail in how that program, which they have at the UMass Medical Center, holds. Now, using the mindfulness approach, meditation is essential, but it's not necessary for an older person to sit in the lotus position. It's pretty tough to get into. I know I can't. Simply sitting up straight in a chair with your eyes slightly closed and attending to the natural in and out of your breathing will do just fine. Another thing that's very helpful is a personal journal. As you know, memoirs have become very, very popular. Everybody's writing a memoir, trying to publish it. But the journal, of course, is something that's, I think, a bit more personal. You're not necessarily trying to tell a history. You're trying to give your impressions, your senses, your emotions, and so on that occur at the time. Some of you may be familiar with Ira Progoff's programs on journal writing. At a Journal Workshop is one of his main books. That's where he has a thing that he calls process meditation, where he gets you into a frame of mind where you're sort of halfway between sleep and wakefulness. And then when you come out of that, then you start writing down what your impressions are. In other words, getting around our usual tunnel vision, which is we've been conditioned to think in a certain way, to pay attention to certain things. But in order to get out of that, one goes through this kind of process meditation. Another thing is even the writing that they do in the journal workshop can be a contemplative kind of thing. It's been said that the tip of the pen is the point of the mind. Now, in this era of tweeting and so on and so forth, a lot of that's getting lost, unfortunately. But nevertheless, that's happening. And then reading, literature. For example, the Transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, and of course, somebody like William Wordsworth, his poetry. And Emily Dickinson, although she died in her 50s, coming up with something, I recall her line, what is, "I'm nobody, who are you?" Are you nobody? At any rate, another obvious type of contemplative practice is prayer. Particularly Thomas Merton's contemplative prayer and Thomas Keating's centering prayer. Now, needless to say, silence is essential to contemplation. And I think there's a saying that goes, "Silence is the language of the Lord, and anything else is a bad translation." And that includes this talk. So thank you for listening, and now I'd like to take questions and comments. Anybody has to say anything?
Just make sure you repeat the question. Sometimes
Oh, sure. My question is, I'm open to questions now. Anything on your handout or whatever? Yes.
Do you think that there is something, some correlation between people still feeling driven in aging with the realization that there is nowhere for our wisdom to go? Nobody's listening.
Oh, good point.
And so that keeps us feeling vibrant, I think, to keep going, to keep involved. And
Yes,
wisdom and
absolutely.
reflection, and we can do it for ourselves, but I think because we don't have as many avenues for sharing that.
Yeah, that's true. It's a very good point. Did you all catch that? The need for activity because you're feeling as though you're not being heard. Very true of later life, socially. One of the things, of course, that gerontologists or psychiatric geriatricians are concerned about is frequently busyness is a defense against despair or depression. That's a possibility. But what you're saying is a perfectly normal type of thing, that indeed one does want to feel and be active in order to stay that way. And again, I go back to what I said in the very beginning. That's all good and appropriate. But the point of the matter is that one really has to be thinking about those later years. You know, some of the books that have been written seem to indicate that, you know, you really don't want to age out at all. You want to get away from it. Any of you familiar with Susan Jacoby's book on the marketing of the new old age? Basically, she really lays it all out in terms of what happens in those later years, particularly in physical and social losses that occur. And there's no kidding around about it. But some of the titles of some of the books you see, it's like you could live forever. Just stay with it, keep pushing. Any other comments? Yes?
Mine is sort of related, that I don't think our culture values being, it only values doing. And so to say, okay, now it's time for you to be at any age, it will be perceived as, and what are you contributing to society?
Yeah. You're right. There's you all heard that. The emphasis is, in fact, on doing, tremendously so. Look, we have to acknowledge the fact that as a society, we're very much into the issues of production and consumption of goods and services, particularly consumption nowadays. I don't know how much we're producing, but at any rate, consumption, very big stuff. And if you're older and you're retired and your income is restricted and all the rest of these things, how much can you consume and how much do you want to? You don't want to consume as much. So you're really not part of that push, that tremendous economic imperative to consume, to buy, and so on. You're left out of that. So in a sense, you're irrelevant, you know, to the economy. Yes?
There's a big emphasis on keeping your memory and not being alone, building social relationships. Where do you get to a point where you have a balance in that?
I'm not sure I heard all of that. You said it's memory.
Everywhere you read on the computer, when you read, there's something about do exercises to keep your memory.
Absolutely. No.
Form relationships. Don't be isolated. You know, and where do you reach a point where you can be?
Right, and yes, that's true. And as I say, that's all well and good. Indeed, that's the case. It's interesting. I was looking at one book. Let's see if I have the title of it here. Where the man has some excellent things for staying active and for being engaged, physically in particular. And I forget what the title is. It said, it's something to the effect of stop aging, get with it. And then he gives a whole set of exercises and so on. And they are probably good exercises and geared for the older body. But nevertheless, here's the title. Change Your Age. Using your body, brain to feel younger, stronger, and more fit. Frank Wildman. Now, he might very well be giving good advice in terms of the exercises. The Susan Jacoby book that I mentioned earlier is Never Say Die, The Myth and Marketing of the New Old Age. So there's a great deal of that. But yes, no question, much of that should be retained. Yes?
You have a theory as to why young people look down or don't respect seniors as opposed to in some other cultures, or especially like in the Old Testament, the people were respected and looked forward to being helpful to them.
Well, as you know, we are and always have been a youth-oriented society. I think that our norms tend to be in that direction. And there hasn't been a great deal of literature and so on that would, let's say, elevate the elder as the wise person and so on, unlike, let's say, Eastern countries such as Japan. Now, as I understand it, they're having that kind of problem in Japan with an enormous rise in the elderly, and yet they're having to give up on caring for the elderly and so on. And I'm sure with that probably goes a lot of respect that the elderly used to have. I don't know. Yes?
I'm wondering that if both of these views of aging are not coming out now because of the evolution of our society. When you talk about elders in past times, sometimes an elder was 32 years old.
Oh, yes, yeah, absolutely. Very good point.
With medicine and so forth not being available, was not expected to be active. And so a young person really had no guidance beyond, say, age 30 or 40 to draw on. Now we live longer and we're healthier, so we're expected, because we're healthier, to be active. And not necessarily just to keep active because we don't want to get old, but because we're healthy enough to do it.
Right, yes, and that's...
And also there's sort of an evolution in thinking in society of going beyond daily existence to something greater than us. And I think this goes across the whole spectrum of society, that they think more. And this is where there's an acceptance of meditation. So you get these new elements coming into aging that just weren't there before.
Good point. That's right. Meditation was, younger people in past generations didn't mean much. Nowadays, ever since the 60s and so on, cultural revolution, as it were, it's now very much part of popular culture. Yes.
In the gerotranscendence findings, the one is a redefinition of the perception of time, space, and objects. Could you just explain a little bit how that changes?
Yeah. Time, space, and so on. Think in terms of smallness. Think of the older person now, let's say relatives have passed away, children have moved away, grandchildren are away. Now let's say that they're in a smaller area, physically, literally. Smaller things also take on a new meaning for them. Doing things more slowly necessarily means you pay more attention to it. It's a smaller perceptual world. And the issue of time, there's a kind of thing I call the accordion phenomenon. It's like when you realize at some moment, my God, what happened? This thing happened 55 years ago. How could that be? Well, that's the accordion going like this, bingo, and it's right up next to you. But then, of course, if you think about it and you reminisce a bit, then you begin to open it up, and then it's more realistic in terms of time. But the time itself takes on very different quality than it does in younger years, where you've got to use time to do things, to get things done. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned an objection to a kind of prevalent idea that busyness is, I think you put it as a defense against depression.
Busyness, yes,
yes. That's the general idea that people kind of buy into. And it seems like now in general psychology is leading more toward mindfulness as a way of addressing depression. Is there some kind of cooperation between gerontology and psychology?
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, there is. Yes. Kabat-Zinn and his group in the Massachusetts University of Massachusetts Medical Center, a number of English psychiatrists have developed treatment regimes using mindfulness to deal with depression and anxiety. And there's a whole protocol, there's a whole field. It's entered all of the major kind of clinical psychological journals. Yeah. Yes.
I was just wondering, it's not only your old age, but it's also your usefulness, whether you are for the society. And I see that in every society, if you are useful to society or useful to someone, if people perceive you that way, then you are respected. It is not just the age itself, but if you are helping, or if people think that you are utilitarian value is there, then you are respected more, whether you are young or old.
You're expecting more if
Respected.
If you're useful.
Oh, respected more. Yes.
Yeah. So it is not only age itself.
Oh, I see.
It's also how useful you are. or how helpful you are. So do you have any comment?
Oh,
on
yeah.
that?
Personality, for example, is a major variable. For example, you take introversion, extroversion as a dimension. A highly extroverted person is going to have a great deal of difficulty dealing with the issue of something like a contemplative approach to aging. It's just, it's not in the genes, as it were. Whereas an introvert might find it's pretty natural. It comes pretty easily to do that sort of thing. If one's been out in society and having to play a social role that didn't quite fit the bill, retirement and so on, you truly retire and that's fine. But most of us are a mix of that sort of thing, and a lot depends, however, as you say, on personality and the kinds of rewards you get as a result of that. Yes.
Are you also speaking to the need, as we're younger, to develop some of these skills and techniques and practices so that we age more contemplatively?
Oh, yes. Right. And the point made earlier that, in fact, younger people are engaging more in things like meditation and yoga and that sort of thing, where there is a more contemplative element to it. There's no question that the background is there for the youth to begin to move in that direction and to perhaps age differently. Now, that's a little different from the boomeritis thing that I was talking about earlier. This is a younger generation still, Generation X, whatever they are now. I don't know. Yes, right. There'd be an easier transition, I think. Good point.
No more questions? Well, Edmund, thanks for stopping by.
My pleasure. Thank you.